And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, this is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Teach Thought Professional Development and the host of this podcast, and thank you for tuning in. A few housekeeping notes. As of today, which we'll publish on May 17th, we are just over 8 days away from registration closing on our PBL Grow 23 event. If you are a teacher, educator, principal, administrator, any of those roles, and you're interested in learning more about project-based learning for yourself, we'd love to have you register and join us in Louisville, June 26th through 28th. You can find more information at wegrowteachers.com/grow23, or if you just go to wegrowteachers.com, our website, you'll see it on the top menu there. As always, I invite you to check out our other school workshops and services for larger groups. We can come to your school or do them online. Everything is focused through the lens of inquiry, project-based learning, differentiated instruction, inquiry, and much more. You can find that again at wegrowteachers.com and checking out the top menu, as well as lots of blogs and other podcast links. If you're so inclined, we would love for you to share and rate and review the podcast and share our blog posts and workshops and services if you're so inclined. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Jermaine Fowler, who is the author of a new book called The Humanity Archive, Recovering the Soul of Black History from a Whitewashed American Myth, and he's also the founder of a project called The Humanity Archive, which you can find at humanityarchive.com, and has podcasts and book clubs and all kinds of interesting features built into that community. I'm not going to go into too many details on the substance of our conversation other than to say this is really one of my favorite books that I've read in many years because he does a masterful job in richly portraying the complexity and nuance of history and humanity and the ways in which we need to look at all of these things from a variety of different viewpoints and questions and being critical and thoughtful. I wish we had had more time to talk about some of the actual stories that he highlights, but we talked and spent a lot of time on the ways in which taking this sort of liberal science approach where we're looking for and thinking about the complexity and nuance of these issues is really, really important. If you're an educator looking for a resource to think more deeply about your teaching of Black history and American history, this is a really wonderful resource and certainly something that you could use with students. Again, wonderful book, one of my favorites, and I could not recommend it more. As usual, I hope this conversation is helpful. All right, Jermaine, welcome to the Teach Thought podcast. Happy to have you on. As I was saying before we started recording, I'm so happy for you with the book. I love the book. We're going to talk about the book and your work, The Humanity Archive, Recovering the Soul of Black History from a Whitewashed American Myth. And why don't you go ahead, as I usually like to do, give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself and give our listeners a little bit background on who you are, how you got there, why you decided to write the book, maybe a little bit, or any other sort of meat you want to put on that bone.
Yeah. Well, I'm Jermaine Fowler. I'm a scholar. I am the founder of the Humanity Archive, which I say is a community of lifelong learners, and we study the stories of humanity to enrich our lives and transform the world. So my background is not in history, actually. I went to school for architecture, but as a kid, I would love to go to the library. I live right up the street from a library, actually, so I was always within those shelves. I read my way out of the library, so I've always had this passion for scholarship, for knowledge, for, truth seeking, just always been endlessly curious. And, my life took some twists and turns, and I wasn't able to pursue professorial degree or anything like that, but never lost that passion for learning and for history. So that kind of came full circle into, me posting on social media and growing a following there, and then getting a book deal based on my writing on social media. Somebody had reached out to me, a publisher, and all that came around. But yeah, everything started for me in the library. I started with the Humanity Archive podcast and me just telling stories of humanity and history and just knowledge and passion is where it all started for me. So here I am now here.
Yeah, well, I have told this story privately, and I don't think I've told this story on the podcast. But early 2020, you had reached out to me, and we had met out in the little town outside of Louisville where I live, and we were talking about some of your work, and I think you had gotten some of it started, but it was kind of just getting up off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I told people, and I think I tweeted, I was like, oh, this is a really interesting project, and we talked a little bit about working together. Of course, then the world fell apart, and COVID hit us all, and we were to Zoom, and perhaps we can rekindle that conversation of collaborating and working together on some things. But I followed you and kept up with your work, like you said, on social media. And social media can be blamed for lots of bad things, but it sounds like this is one of the silver linings, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I see you've got this book, and I took a look at the book, and it is just a really wonderful, rich, interesting piece of work. And I just want to, sort of say up front, like, if you're an educator and thinking about history, and especially history in the context of Black history, but certainly not just Black history, this is, I think, a really useful book for educators to read and perhaps even use with their students. And maybe we can talk about ways in which that might sort of play out and where you maybe have seen that. But I guess maybe starting with the prologue of the book and thinking about why, one of the things that I really thought was interesting is your sort of journey and evolution, a sort of metamorphosis as you thought about Black history, and I love the idea of humanity, right? Our shared humanity. And it is important to recognize our individual differences, but our shared humanity, we can't lose that. And in our tribal, partisan, polarized world, that's really easy to do, and we see evidence of it, and you write about it. And so I think it might be really useful to sort of set the stage for how you evolved over time in your thinking and your view of some of those elements, especially through the lens or context of Black history.
Yeah, so it all started in class for me, just frustration, some anger there in terms of learning Black history. And then you kind of have the Black Mount Rushmore, the Frederick Douglasses and the Rosa Parkses and Harriet Tubmans, and, that longing, knowing something else has to be there, right? And just the convenience of me living so close to that library. So I think to myself, okay, where's the most logical place for me to go to, find out more stories? Of course, the library, everybody is represented in the library. So I go to the Black history section, and, I'm finding all this information out that's, just missing. It's just missing. It's not incorporated into the textbook that I was reading really in any way that's significant, or I just didn't feel like Black people were part of the American story, how I was reading it in the textbook versus, all the contributions of Black people throughout world history that I was reading in those books from the library. So, at first, I was kind of seeped in some anger there. I really was just angry at the way history was being taught. And I read a lot of Afrocentric books who kind of took the stance of, Black people almost created everything, right? Like everything started in Africa with African civilizations. And, the young me wasn't really following the trail of all the evidence. There was definitely some shoddy evidence with some of the books I was reading in terms of that. But, I clung to that emotionally, though. It's kind of like a shield against this history from a Eurocentric view that said Black people are inferior, there was no contributions out of Africa or from Black people, so it was kind of a shield for that. But as I evolved in my thinking, I realized that a lot of the Afrocentric thought just kind of mimicked the worst of Eurocentric thought, right? It was, denigrated all things European, just like the worst of Eurocentric thought denigrated all things African. So I saw that, it's two sides of the same coin. So I kind of started to rethink things and bring this idea together of, okay, I want to be able to talk about race and think about race and, all these differences that we have, but what is the silver lining? I mean, what is the commonalities that we have? What are the threads that tie us all together? And for me, that just kept coming back to humanity. So, as I read different books from different sections, I just started seeing a lot of things that were similar among people, and just kind of taking that view as my central view of, okay, we could talk about all these things. Do have all these divisions and things we need to talk about, but where do we come back to? We always have to kind of come back to this human experience. I have this quote on my wall by Terrence: "I am human, so nothing human is alien to me." Right. So to be able to look to across nations, across culture, across race or class or any of that, and still see the things that bring us together. See a mirror to yourself.
Yeah. Well, you're in the prologue. One of the sentences that I highlighted that I thought was an interesting distinction and way to think about this is that we should not study Black history. Rather, we should study Black people in history. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about that. And as you note in the book, that the idea of race is actually a made up thing, right? Like it is not genetically or biologically true, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And there are, we use it sort of as a social construct. And I don't know necessarily that we have to. And I've been really interested in some of the work of sort of race abolitionism and thinking about the ways in which you might do that. But there's a bit of a conflict there insofar as how we think about moving forward with that recognition, but also recognizing the ways in which race as a social construct, or however you want to, however it's been used, and it has been used in different ways and sort of constructed and created in different ways, how that has affected things leading up to today. So we can say, oh, it'd be great in 100 years if we all recognize that race is not real, and while we have some differences in skin pigmentation and blah, 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 none of those things are particularly more interesting than the color of one's eyes or hair or whatever, but also reckoning with the ways in which those factors have played out, right? So, when you think about what it means to be Black or to be white, and that sort of identitarianism and pluses and minuses that go along with that, how does that sort of jumble around in your head?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conversation, and it's almost dare I say, it's a radical conversation. When you talk about race abolitionism and I've definitely seen some of those conversations happening in terms of, okay, we know that race is a biological construct, but we keep leaning back on that construct, though, and I talk about that a little bit in my chapter on identity as well. Is the identity self-constructed, or is it constructed by society? I think it's a little bit of both. But if we were to say race doesn't exist, which is scientifically true, but then we still have to look at the history and how is it playing out, and society as a whole would have to agree on some sort of new framework in terms of how we think about race. And yeah, I'm not sure if America's quite ready to do that yet, or even to have that conversation. I think there's pockets of people talking about that, but I think a lot more conversation needs to be had around that, and just starting with that baseline, though. Race is a social construct. We have to agree on that, right? That's what the science says. There's
right.
No, I mean, well,
right.
From different regions, climates, people are what they are based on
right.
where they were geographically located. I mean, we could talk about differences in culture, but race, how do we deconstruct that? I say in the book, I have more questions than answers, but I think that is a question we need to be asking more. Right. And trying to, if people talk about dismantling, I mean, that's kind of where you start, right? Is to start with that social construct place.
Yeah. As you'd say, I think people would say it's radical and have said it's radical and really push back. You do talk about the 1619 Project, and of course, Nicole Hannah-Jones has a famous tweet or something about being politically Black, which kind of gets at that, right? Like this sort of idea that there are things that we have in common based on the quote unquote race, and that's not necessarily true. And I really like how you throughout the book sort of, I guess in some ways, sort of take a contrarian view, or say, that this may be true, but we can't neglect this. And you do that in a number of different places. Like when you think about being quote unquote Black, how do you define that?
That's a good question. I look at black as a culture, I look at it based in history and, shared historical experiences, amongst black Americans, things that, we might look back to and find a bond in terms of, not only slavery, but maybe even global black realities. And then some of it is tied to racism and how black people have been treated through history and some of the bonds that have been formed out of that over time. Uh, so I think for me, it's more it's a cultural. It's not so much it's deeper than skin. It's more of a cultural experience, a shared cultural experiences, whether it be music or shared history between black people. But even in my book too, I talk. I mean, how deep even does that go? Because I see now there's a lot of rift between Black Americans and immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
from Africa coming over, and like there's there used to be this idea of Pan Africanism, and we're gonna come together under this banner where we're kind of fighting this colonialism plus the racism in America, and there was a bonds that were formed from that. But now I see even the tribalism between Black Americans and African immigrants. So.
Right.
Even so I'm always questioning, that's me. I mean, I'm always questioning and rethinking and reformulating my viewpoints, but I definitely think black is culture for me. But again, then I ask the question, like, how deep does that go, because that's
Mm.
kind of being severed now, as we see it with these rifts that are forming.
Yeah, because you do, at least in one point. I think I noted here on page 115 for anybody who's got the book in front of them, the sort of the idea of being like it used to be that black was in the American context, in the United States context, was sort of associated with being African,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't really even a whole reading of it, and now it's sort of widened, it's sort of flattened, but then again, as you know, again, Nicole Hannah Jones would say, you're politically black or you're not. I mean, sort of finding those lines of demarcation. And like one of my very good friends, is his dad is. I'm assuming I haven't checked with him, but I would assume he's African American,
Mm-hmm.
and then his mom is Korean. And it's a little bit weird in some sense if you really think about it, that most people will consider him as a black person, but
Mm-hmm.
does that sort of, some people say, well, that erases that Korean heritage and that ethnicity, and that's a really weird thing. And we see these sort of gradations based on how people act, and then there are people who are ostracized, as you mentioned, because
Mm-hmm.
they're not politically black, and there's not really a question there other than the fact that it's just a really complex kind of
It
set of
really is. It
circumstances.
really is. Because I mean, on the one hand, you do have the historic racism with the one drop rule, of course, the
Hmm.
one drop of black blood, and you're considered black. So you have people who go over to Europe and they're like, "What do you mean you're black?" Like you look
Yeah.
pretty white, right? But in America, you got that one drop if they, you know, uh, from the lineage, that you would be considered to be black here. But then, on the other hand, too, you also have colorism as well that people don't talk about as much, where lighter skinned people are treated with more
Mm-hmm.
privilege even within the black community, and this idea of being black enough and not black enough. So I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this race conversation that would have to be deconstructed and talked about more openly, I think, with more honesty. In order for it to be broken down. I think again, people just fall to the easier arguments, this side versus that side. The targets are easy. It's,
Right.
historic back and forth. People have dug their trenches, but I get a sense that more people would be willing to talk about these things from not a centrist perspective, but more, I think that the media plays it to where it's like extreme versus extreme, but I think
Mm-hmm.
most people fall somewhere within the extremes. You might be a little farther to the left or a little farther to the right, but I think there's more dialogue that would be willing to be had between people so we can get to these nuances that would really allow us to deconstruct, any of the problems that we have in America, including race for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm with you on that. And I have been really sort of ideating and sort of thinking on and sort of meditating on ways in which we might sort of advocate for an approach in our education system, but even outside of education, especially as I think about these bills that are targeting, critical race theory, and I put that in air
Mhm.
quotes, and some of the other things, trans and things that we're seeing in the banning of books, a bit on the left and a bit on the right, certainly, and thinking about how do we, instead of saying don't do this, don't talk about this, don't say this, advocate for the sort of liberal science approach, right? This idea that we're looking for pluralism, we're looking for that viewpoint diversity, we're looking for ways in which we can put our ideas forward and have them tested, and that no one person has authority. And I think that's even one of the things that I highlighted in the book that you wrote is, like there is no one, no one holds a monopoly on truth is the way that you put it, right? And the tribal version of it is that we do have people who have the truth by the dint of maybe their skin color or quote unquote identity, or Trump would say, "I have the truth." I mean, I think he's probably said that multiple times, and how dangerous that is.
Yeah, there's definitely forms of populism for sure, and to where people blindly follow the quote unquote leaders, and that's within, white circles, black circles. There's these people who are kind of designated as the authority, and then everybody just falls in line with that way of thinking, which kind of goes to that back and forth, because you stand on this side, I stand on this side, and we're kind of following behind these thought leaders or these authorities almost, and that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. I mean, because they could walk you right off a cliff, and you're not even seeing that you're about to go over a cliff, and that's what's happened throughout history with these populist type of leaders. And when we don't have that kind of democratic consensus and that square where we can come together with this diversity of ideas, but I think especially in scarier times, people tend to follow that authority even more, right? When people are in fear, or, they're uncertain about things. So, I can't remember the politician who said democracies don't last very long. I mean, it's a pessimistic view, right? But I think it's because people are fearful, and they tend to follow those kind of authorities. So I'm curious. I'm going to flip the question to you. I mean, do you think that's possible to have that, this kind of dream almost of a diversity kind of a diversity of views, and I see what you're like, the conversations and the framework where this could be successful in that way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's an ideal that we have to continually pursue, and I would argue that our country, the best parts of our country, were sort of founded on that.
Absolutely.
And as an ideal that we're constantly in pursuit of, and we have obviously fallen way short of it in times and in many ways, but it does. So one of my favorite authors is Jonathan Rauch, and he wrote in 1993 Kindly Inquisitors, and that is just a really wonderful book that when you read it, and you see the copyright is 1993, and you think, how did this not get written in 2020 or something? Like he uses the terminology anti-racism and talking about the ways in which there are sort of threats on free speech and thought, and sort of a pushback on authoritarian, sort of pushback on by populists, and Frederick Douglass would be a great example of somebody who would advocate for that sort of liberal science approach. And then you fast forward, I think it was 2020, he wrote Constitution of Knowledge, and it's absolutely wonderful sort of addendum. And what he advocates for there, and sort of I think is a really important piece to add on, like we obviously have sort of structures and policies and laws and the First Amendment in place to allow for free speech and things like that, but it takes a culture, right? So I think, to answer your question, yes, we can make progress towards that, and we should be pushing, and that's one of the things I love about your book, is it really, I can feel that spirit in, at least to me, coming through of like, let's look at this in all of its complexity, not just one narrow sort of, this suits my tribal vision and warfare needs. And so, like, I would say similarly, like the Second Amendment, I think the Second Amendment is very important, but we also have to have a culture that goes with responsible sort of gun ownership and things like that, right? So I think that the important piece is, or I guess to answer your question is, it feels like some of that is slipping away,
Hmm.
It really does.
There's never been absolute, right? There's no absolutes. I think people tend to think of
Right.
democracy or authoritarianism. I mean, these are very strong terms that we are emotionally tied to, but there's never been an absolute democracy. It's always had
Right.
this ebb and flowed and back and forth, as you're saying. And maybe right now we're slipping back away from that. So, I guess the question will be, how do we regain our footing then, rather than, whether it's just we've just never been all the way there. But we don't want to slip back too far because it could
Yeah.
go to a point of no return at some point.
Yeah, well, it's really hard to tell because, as you mentioned, you sort of had these really noisy extremes on
Hmm.
on left and right to make it the most simple version
Absolutely.
of it, and it's not that simple. But I would agree with you. I think the majority of people are somewhere in between there and wanting to have those conversations, whether they're having them or whoever's having them in public, that they are more sort of moderate and more pluralistic and more critical thinking. I mean, there's a lot of people that they're not even paying attention. They don't care, right?
Absolutely.
They,
Yeah, you're right.
and that's fine. They don't have to. But the noisiest people are just yelling back and forth. I mean,
Hmm.
I saw a tweet and it really, to me, sort of encapsulated this. I saw Ibram X. Kendi, who quote tweeted Betsy DeVos. And Betsy DeVos was talking about, basically, I guess, the recent scores that our civics education scores are way down.
Hmm.
And she said, well, this is what happens when you teach critical race theory and blah, blah, blah. You can fill in the blanks of what she might say there, right?
Yeah, yeah, but
Yeah. And then Ibram X. Kendi came back and quote tweeted her with, some sort of similar language of like, what he would say, that fits his world vision and view. And I can imagine whoever is on which, if one of those is your sort of tribal leader, one of your sort
mhm.
of prophets, you're
Yeah,
like, yes, they're exactly right, and they're exactly wrong. Matter of
yeah,
fact,
and
somebody
that
came back,
duplicates itself
yeah,
over and over and replicates into the next tweet or the next post or the next, whatever it is. And lo and behold, it's really none of those things. I mean, if you look at the literacy rates, that's what we should be focusing on in general. Um, it's funny because, and I speak to this, there's definitely history that's not being taught, but what difference does it make if like half of the kids can't even read properly? Because I'm an
right,
advocate of just throwing a bunch of books at kids, right? Just give them all the books and let them sort out and critically think their way out of the mess of history and come to their own conclusions. I mean, I think that's the best way. I don't think we teach history right. As we're trying to teach it this one set narrative. There is no one set narrative. There's so many opinions and viewpoints, and
right.
see which one you lean toward. Let's give them the tools they need to be able to draw their own conclusions and opinions for themselves. But I think we focus too much on teaching kids what to think instead of how to think. And
Hmm.
definitely there's some with any country, there's this installation of kind of patriotism that's infused in the history, storytelling, and
Hmm.
it's not so much about critical thinking, but that's what they're going to get, though. It's depending on what state they're in. It's going to be leaning more toward
Hmm.
the left or the right version of history, and it's going to be based more on politics and what people think kids should be learning versus really teaching kids history like historians learn it, historiography, where you're citing sources, you're looking at multiple books, and you're drawing your own conclusions, I think. And so the real problem is the literacy rates. We need to be focused on teaching kids how to read better so they can figure it out for themselves. But
Yeah,
they're arguing about, you know, it's this boogeyman of the critical race theory, and people just latch onto that fear, right? Those
right.
conversations are a lot more provocative, I guess, than ones like we're having now with more nuance to them.
Right, they're more appealing. They're like junk food and
Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
saccharin
Yep.
and sugar high, and our media and social media has produced that for sure. One other thing that jumped out in your so the way you described your sort of K-12 education, and I can't remember when it was when you've had your first racialized black teacher,
Hmm.
and but it was fairly far along. And on the other hand, I was talking to somebody about this just recently. He's like, so I grew up in Michigan in this little pig farming community. I mean, I graduated with 89, so tiny little
Hmm.
school, and I had racialized black teachers. We had a principal. I mean, it was certainly more racialized white by the statistical averages, but it was not unusual for that to happen. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because you would think the further south you would go, and a sort of Louisville, I would say, is sort of an antebellum kind of. It's arguable whether Louisville's north or south, but that you would see somebody in Louisville like yourself having a more sort of diverse teaching experience, and how that affected your view of race and your sort of evolution, and affected mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. I do bring that up in the book. I mean, of course, there's more white teachers. I think it's like 80 some odd percent. But you would think though that Louisville, with a significant black population, that there would have been a black teacher before I think I was in 7th or 8th grade when I first had my first black teacher. Yeah. So, I think that we got to be able to zoom in and out. I know everybody's experience isn't the same. I think I took a poll on my social media one time. Of course, it's anecdotal, but there are a lot of people who hadn't had a black teacher till way later as well, or sometimes even in college. But then you'll have other people who are like, yeah, right in Head Start. But I think for me, the point was just being the effect that I think it might have had not having someone, outside of my home teaching me any history or anything who looked like me, and just kind of psychologically, not seeing too much representation in the teaching field, and once I did get a black teacher, having somebody who at least I thought back then might have related to me a little bit in terms of, as a young black man, as a black male teacher. So, just having that, I think, was important for sure during that time, or even seeing that. And I just kind of wish I would have had that a little earlier, in my experience in school.
Yeah, I mean, I am not one to lean into that sort of identitarianism, but I do recognize and think it's important to, at least in some ways, as you're sort of alluding to, like some sort of shared experiences, which may or may not necessarily be true based on the skin color, but is maybe more likely to be true for sure. So you mentioned sort of this sort of depth of and width of things that kids should read and be exposed to, and of course the meme that goes around is all these dead white men, right? So it sounds almost like you're advocating for what some people would call classical education, right? That like sort of read it all, and I guess have you had people push back on you about that? I'm wondering, even have you had people say you're not sort of, I guess, politically black, or sort of doing the white supremacy culture thing, or some versions of that?
I don't really present myself as an activist in any way like that, though. I present myself as I'm a questioner. I'm a scholar. I'm just presenting information. I'm not really so much taking a stance on that, right now to where I just really want to get people to think and learn for themselves, to where I have opinions and I put those in the book. But even in the beginning of the book, I have like my framework of how I study history. I don't want you to just hear what Jermaine has to say or my opinions. I keep it mostly fact-based in the book, but I talk about the uses and abuses of history. I talk about what I think about as the heart of history, and studying history with some type of empathy, where you try to put yourself in the shoes of, those from the past, and just this framework that I have, so you can see how I think. Because if I'm, presenting myself as an educator, right, it's not my job, in my view, to tell people what specifically to think about history. So, I think, there's a lot of kind of historian activists out there, journalist activists out there, but and that's how they present themselves, and it makes sense for them to kind of take the stances they take. But mine is more of an educator and somebody who's a truth seeker and a questioner is more of the position I take. So, but I've gotten some raised eyebrows for sure, because I challenge a lot of I don't just it's not just the dead white man. For me, it's okay, we could talk about racism. We could talk about the fact that, a lot of these presidents even were slave owners, and that has been whitewashed for sure. However, I think I make the analogy of, I think we should destroy that to some degree of, and I don't mean destroy it like physically, just more like, go after that. We can be critical of that, but we don't want it to be like chemotherapy where we destroy the healthy cells, because it just goes after all the cells, right? There's still great things we can pull from Thomas Jefferson, even with the atrocities that he, committed against enslaved people. But he, the ideals that he had, those are universal. You don't just have to tie those to him. I mean, those are universal ideas that might not only ideas that maybe he, somebody in another culture might have said that in another way, right? So can we, at the same time, be critical of history, but also learn from history? I think a lot of people have trouble with that. It's either or for a lot, instead of, again, with that nuance and complexity. And I really, because it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do. And I talk about Black slave owners, and in terms of people being sold from Africa to America. I talk about whenever they sent freed Black people to Africa, Liberia, they took the same framework and started to treat the native-born Africans the same way they were treated in America. So how does power, play out? Why is it always A over B? How do we have power A through B? So, I'm able, I think, in the book to get to the particulars, but never lose sight of the universal. Get to the, identity, but never lose sight of the humanity at the same. So I ebb and flow back and forth. And I think that's what makes the book unique and what's raised some eyebrows. I haven't really gotten any pushback, though, from that. Maybe a little bit about the, when I started talking about Africa and kind of turning the lens back inward, but not much. Most people were appreciative of the book and how it's presented.
Yeah, well, that comes through the way that you said it. I mean, definitely comes through to me. One of the ways that the sort of memes and terminology gets sort of weaponized, and they strip the complexity and nuance of things when they do it. And so something like white supremacy and white supremacy culture being one of the several or many things, right? So it strikes me that certainly there is, and there are white supremacists in the country and in the world, but there's also this sort of conflation and flattening, like that almost everything becomes white supremacy culture.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful. And I also think about it, and I'm wondering if you've how you think about this or this distinction that it's not necessarily always, or in some ways isn't, white supremacy culture, but a Western supremacy culture.
That's a interesting point. Western supremacy culture. Yeah, there's definitely. I mean, so expand on that just a little bit, because ultimately, even Black people in America. I mean, how much? There's a Black culture, which is a subculture, but even Black people in America, we are American. We don't have a lot of ties to Africa, the culture there. There have been points in history where people have tried to reach back, identify with Africa. But I think one thing I talk about in my book too is how, Black people are kind of an exilic people in America. There's been a lot of time in history where Black people tried to be, as American as possible and still weren't accepted as American. And, American, of course, being by and large, and a lot of the ideas, a lot of Western thought, as far as the culture, there's a lot more mixture, I think. But as far as the thought, and the politics of America, it's largely Western for sure. So, I think there's a lot at play there. And I think, Western supremacy. Yeah, expand on that a little bit for me.
Well, I was doing a podcast,
especially versus white supremacy. I've never heard the dichotomy kind of presented before. I think
I was talking with somebody, and I apologize to forget her name, because it was on a podcast quite some time ago, and she actually made that distinction, and I thought, that's really interesting, and I don't know if this historically holds up. You would know better than I, but sort of this European Western culture, right? Which
Absolutely.
a lot of our government and the ideals that we've talked about are sort of built from there,
Hmm.
or imported from there. And one of the things that you identify in the book, and is certainly true, is that there were wonderful advancements and innovations and all kinds of those kinds of things in sort of African cultures and other
Hmm.
cultures that were non-Western, right?
Absolutely.
And it's a question of, well, why did those not become adopted or become more well
Mm.
known and those kinds of things? And some of them are similar, and some of them might be different. Like I think you
Yeah.
talk about, I want to say it was some sort of math. I want to say African mathematics, but that doesn't sound exactly right. There was a different kind of or way to think about math,
Absolutely.
right? So I struggle with it because I am lean more towards sort of this race abolitionism. I struggle even thinking about or using this sort of terminology of black and white, and like I don't identify as white in ways that, like, when I see a white supremacist or somebody who's acting that way, like I don't think, oh, that's one of mine. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't. I don't identify with them, I guess is a way I say it. But I would say in many ways they're not, and maybe as I'm thinking out loud
Representative,
here.
do you think, of the larger
Yeah, I don't know that they're identify. I don't know that they're using a sort of Western cultural ideals. They're maybe that's not quite right. Again, I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but this distinction between Western and non-Western being maybe more useful and important than the melatonin in people's skin.
hmm Yeah. I don't know if I agree with that or not, honestly. I think it is important to add that framework in there. And you know, there is this thought of, why. I mean, I think it's tied to power. Who gained power, in the makings of America, and that's kind of the narrative that was I mean, whoever had power, right? So, I mean, we're bringing in ideas from everywhere, and there is this pluralism that's
Mm-hmm.
coming forth, and but it was Puritans and people from Europe who gained power, so those ideas were uplifted, over the others. It's not like everybody was sitting down and seeing how we could bring this stuff together, but for me, I think when it comes to Western culture, is just the non-acknowledgement. There's a book called The Dawn of Humanity I have over here, and it just talks about how much of European thought was kind of an amalgamation of, Chinese statecraft. I mean, in the Europeans back in, whenever they were kind of coming up with these systems, they acknowledged that then, and they got quote after quote after quote in the book. And there's a lot of indigenous thought that's gone into the making of what we would call Western culture, but it's almost like it's this, homogenous thing that's
Mm-hmm.
there's pluralism even within Western thought. What is Western thought? Like, I
Right,
mean,
right.
when it boils down to it, I mean, it just always comes back to me to that idea of humanity, right? There is no pristine culture. There is no, nobody has a monopoly, like you said on truth, or I say in the book on truth. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's all an amalgamation through. I mean, if you go back far enough, it's all just fragments of another thing that we've locked into these very rigid ideas of race or Western this or Eastern that, when it's really, I mean, it's all comes back to the same source, right?
Right,
um,
right. Yeah.
how do we get back to that? So I definitely sense what you're saying of how do we break that down again. Why is race something? I mean, as we know it, it's been around how long? Several hundred years, whatever. Like, does have to last forever? I mean, as it stands now, the way people are locked into it, you think it would have to go on for another 300 years, but I
Yeah.
mean, does it?
Yeah, it unfortunately it that is, as much as I think both of us would like for it to be marginalized, it probably will be with us for quite some time. And as much as I would like for that to change, and as many things as I will do for that to change,
Yeah.
but when you think about education and the ways in which we teach history now, to the extent that you are aware of it. I mean, I don't know if you're looking at curriculums and things like that, but how would you describe it now? I mean, have we made progress, or are we similar, or are we going backwards? And like, how does that feel in your world?
I think it's I think it's largely the same. I look back and a lot of these battles over history have been going on for a very long time on, these political back and forths on how people want history taught. So that's very consistent throughout American history, especially in public education. Um, I think that, from outside looking in, I have kids too, and they tell me some things they learn in school. But I mean, there's a lot of rote memorization that's going on in terms of, just memorizing those facts, those dates. But, I don't think that's where real knowledge is formulated, because we know with rote memorization, I mean, you forget the thing that you learned however many months or, years after, you're not really getting into the meat of the story, or there's really not enough narrative, I think, to where, you're going to gain any knowledge or understanding or empathy or any of those things from history that I think kids need. So,
well, do you get the sense that, because I know, again, you're in Louisville, and I know there are some schools that are focused on, as I understand it, African American culture and I don't know. I'm curious how you feel about those schools, and sort of, in some ways, sort of a recreation of racial segregation, but this sort of focus on Black history. Do you get the sense that we're telling a wider and better story of history these days, or does it feel different at all?
I think people are trying, and there's people on the, because I mean, I've seen some efforts to get Black history like more taught in schools, but then you get to this point where I think it just goes back to, how do we teach kids from a diversity of books? Because everybody's trying to, what happens is you just have all these different electives, right? And nothing's really brought together in any kind of way. So, you might have a African studies elective, or, people might get frustrated, and then you have this school that's focused on, this Black experience, or this, Black history framework, as opposed to people looking more of like, how do we bring all this together? That's what I saw. It's still, like you said, you're right. It's still some segregation and separation. And I don't feel like, I think people just almost have gave up in a lot of ways of like, how do we, bring these different cultural histories, ethnic histories, racial histories together to teach kids so that they can make sense of it and still see themselves represented as well at the same time, and be critical thinkers out of all this.
If you were to draw a chart, a line graph on progress in the United States on issues having to do with race and racism, would it be a constant up, or would there be ups and downs? And where would you have us on that line graph now?
I think in terms of like legally, was much progress. I mean, much progress has been made. It's nowhere near, 1965 or 68 or anything, in terms of the a lot of the legal barriers that were struck out. But in terms of individuals, that's hard to tell. I talk about in the book too that you can't really, I'm not one to tell somebody how they feel. I don't know how anybody feels, and so it's hard to survey that of like the barometer of thought, of emotion, of racial prejudice, person to person. That's something I think it's up to each of us to go inside to work that out within our own selves. But I think there has definitely been progress legally. In the workforce, economically, even in terms of who has access to different opportunities to try to make it in America. So progress, but I think progress is relative, right? If you're born now, the average person might not be looking back to they might just be looking at where they're at now and saying, oh man, like I still have some barriers to opportunities now, that might be better than my great grandparents, but we still have, some distance to go. So, but I think you need that context too, though, because if not, you can get too pessimistic. I think, if you're just looking at it like, we only have progress instead of looking at some of the progress we made. I've seen people get caught up in this cycle of pessimism. We can never make it in America, kind of, that pessimism that really is self-defeating and is not going to allow you to grow. Like, if I see this history is not being taught in a way that, I should write the book, kind of like that hope of like, we got to do something. We can't just sit here and, with the lack of progress.
I mean, it's easy to get the impression that things are going backwards, and perhaps they are. You know, it's hard to know because what we see in the media and what we're presented with, it doesn't feel like it's a full accounting of the truth, and it's certainly tribalistic. But when we see, you know, like I hear, and I'm sure you heard, you know, Joe Biden say this is Jim Crow 2.0 or Jim Eagle, or to your, you know, you sort of alluded to it before, Nicole Hannah-Jones saying that something like no matter what, you know, the circumstances might be, a black person can't make it in today's world or something like that. Of course, she's cashing checks pretty well and doing well, and probably very likely has been you know, subject to racism at the same time as progressing and doing well. So, you know, it I think kind of gets to one of the chapters that you have, which is excellence or equality, and the idea of personal responsibility versus the social contract and the idea of pursuing greatness. So maybe you can sort of give the elevator pitch for that chapter and your thinking there.
Yeah, I think for me, it's always about complexity and nuance. And I think people tend to look at the either or. You know, a lot of people talk about the meritocracy and, you know, this American idea that, you know, you can climb up the ladder no matter who you are. And, you know, even if you have more barriers than somebody else, like you could still climb. You just might have to go up a couple of more rungs. You know, I think that's, you know, the typical right-wing thought of things in terms of you know, making your way in America and the whole bootstraps idea. But then on the other end, you have people who would say that, no, like, you know, it's unequal and we need to fight for, you know, this idea of equality and or even equity now, to where we should all be starting from the same starting point, period. So there's not really a lot of focus on the excellence part of things, or, you know, how can you progress? So I just wanted to dive. I mean, again, it's just, for me, it's about diving to the mess of both of those and seeing, like, is it excellence or equality, or can we have both? And so I pull examples from history of, you know, Black people who have striven for excellence in various fields, and also those who have, you know, fought for equality, and just kind of see how that all came together. And again, I think I leave with more questions than answers, but I just want to open. I would try to go to the places, the unbeaten paths, just to open up the dialogue and open up people's curiosity and thoughts, to hope to get some of these conversations going more, and kind of get people out of those trenches and to walk out and consider some of these things.
Yeah, and one of the other pieces that you point out that resonates with me, and I have talked about it a few times. I had a younger guy on the podcast some time ago, Bertrand Cooper, and I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he really highlights the point, and he lived it in many ways. You know, grew up in poverty and lots of drug action, and, you know, all of the things that you might imagine would be disadvantages going along with that. And he has matriculated, you know, done very well for himself in terms of education, and I don't know, financially, maybe not, but you point out one of the things that does seem to happen, and I'm curious if you see this sort of as a historical trend, or if it's just more recent, is the sort of focus on, or lost focus on, those sort of low socioeconomics and those who might be actually most affected by racism and, you know, discrimination and prejudice and the things, and this is what Bertrand would say, is that the lots of the sort of quote unquote anti-racist kinds of efforts that we see today are actually benefiting the sort of more successful racialized Black people than the folks in, you know, the West End of Louisville, who really do need it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't. A lot of these debates are academic debates. You know, they're going on in ivory towers between professors who, you know, write their books, and you know, some of them catch on in the media, which makes them seem like they are these kind of universal arguments that everybody's thinking about. But I don't think the average person, you know, who is in the impoverished, you know, I mean, they're not really thinking. I mean, they're thinking about how can they do better, or, you know, thinking about the plights that they're in, or the, you know, what's going on in their neighborhood, right? I don't think anti-racism, you know, I think that's, you know, Yeah, I think there's just these things right throughout history, and we see, ebbs and flows in terms of it's always going to be something, right? It's anti-racism now. There'll be something now. Before it was multiculturalism, and there was a back and forth about that idea in the '90s. Oh my God, we can't have this in our schools. So there's these historic debates that go on and on. But I don't think it always addresses the root issue or the people that that should be getting help by some of these debates. That they go on over and over again, just under different names and different definitions and terms.
Yep. Well, you mentioned towards the end of the book, as we're talking about the chapter is "Are We a Democracy Yet?" And you mentioned some black conservatives that, again, will, if you say them out loud, you might get in trouble with a certain set, right? You've got Ben Carson, Glenn Lowry, who's been on this podcast, and I agree with some of the things he says, and I think he asks great questions. And lots of folks on the sort of anti-racist left would say, he's a tool of white supremacy or things like that. So it's really interesting. But then you also talk about as you say, the refusal of white-dominated party. This is, I'm assuming, the Republican Party, the right, to allow any internal dissent or criticism from its minority of black members. So I'm curious, can you kind of expound on that? What you mean by that?
Yeah. So, first and foremost, I think that to be able to be free, to be able to be fully human, I think that, in terms of black history, like we have to acknowledge, like black thought is just can't be like pigeonholed or narrowed into, people think of this only like black Democrats or, there's a lot of interest in black radical history, but there's every black person's we're not a monolith, right? Like people have thought differently.
Imagine that.
A lot of people would say that, you're quote unquote not black almost if you were a black conservative. Mm-hmm. And I'm a progressive thinker myself. However, I don't agree with that. I want to hear a diversity of thought. I want to dig back and just see what, some black conservatives had to say. I've got, books on my shelf that I don't agree with, but I want to, if anything, it'll help me sharpen my own arguments. And sometimes it'll contradict my arguments and make like, oh, well, maybe I need to rethink that position, right? That's happened several times before. So, first and foremost, just the black humanity has to go with being the fullness of a black experience and thought and all its diversity. But in terms of black conservatives not having a voice so much within the conservative party, or the voice of dissent rather, and I look back through history, I didn't see a lot of places where, it's almost like a lot of the black conservatives that I was reading, they just stuck right along, the party lines. There was not really a lot of diversity of thought within, the black conservative bubbles. So it's, and that could be true of a lot of political ideologies, right? The mimicking of talking points, and a lot of people say exactly what you would expect them to say. And that's one thing I have to respect about Glenn Lowry, because he actually does kind of go, he has some nuance in terms of his conversations, but a lot of the black conservatives I read in history, establishment, black conservatives, they were kind of mimicking a lot of the conservative points, and I couldn't really go against anything. So I don't know that I've seen that as accepted in the conservative party at all, of any dissent from black people.
Yeah, well, what you're describing again is what I would say is sort of classic liberalism or liberal science, and that seeking out of, and I too have books on my bookshelf. Like I read an example of is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. I find it, sort of logically absurd in many ways, but it's like, oh, okay, so you take a look at it, and as you said, it sort of sharpens your argument, gives you an opportunity to sharpen your argument. And there are some things that, oh, that's an interesting thought, or this is an interesting idea, and you don't have to take it wholesale. It does sort of get at the complexity of humans and of an argument as opposed to the sort of flattening. Have you been, or have you had an opportunity, because we've sort of hinted around and talked about, some of these people like a Kendi or a Glenn Lowry or somebody who is a bigger name and making speaking appearance. Have you been around in sort of any meaningful way some of those people and interacted with them sort of intellectually, I guess, in ways that they might get the sense of the ways that you are thinking with complexity and nuance? And if so, how has that landed? And maybe it's not with sort of the big names. Maybe it's with folks in the community or other places.
Well, yeah, I haven't engaged with them yet. I mean, and I would hope to at some point, but usually in my Q&As during like keynote speeches, that's when I would get the more nuanced conversations with the people. And some people, I've definitely got some, I wouldn't call it pushback, but some questions that, people question me or maybe a little critical of, because I don't fall in line with, this establishment way of like thinking. And I think that's more what I might have been getting at with the, but it's more of an establishment, right? You toe the line of the establishment. So, typically somebody who writes a book as I've written, would be, using the terms, white supremacy a lot. They would be talking a lot about, institutional racism, all those kind of, the words that you use to kind of fall in line. So, I mean, I've had people question me on that. Like, I think in one speech, I didn't even say white supremacy at all. And somebody's like, why don't you call that white supremacy or something like that? So I got in a debate, about that with them. So, yeah, there's definitely been, and I think that's going to be true more and more, as I kind of hold my position and kind of have this, more unique approach of humanity at the center. Where people would probably question, why aren't I talking about things that would be expected of somebody, in my position or who's written a book how I've written. So I've gotten a little bit of a sprinkle of that, but not really big yet.
Well, I think it's interesting that you got the publishing deal and that I don't want to say it this way necessarily, but I don't have better words, is that you are allowed to write the book and that it has been promoted, and it's wonderful and maybe great news that it's done so well, right? And maybe people thought they were getting something different and they bought the book and went, this is not what I wanted to, this doesn't make me angry like I really want to be angry, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's been received just because I think people sense the realness, and I think that me putting a lot of my personal story and journey in the book is what I've kind of gotten feedback on in terms of, I'm not presenting this as just the overly academic text. This is just my journey as a human being through history and just trying to see what Black history means to me and what human history means to me and like how does all that fit together. So I think people see that. So me telling my own story, rather than taking some overly political stance or, activist stance, I think people kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. This is just a personal journey for me, like, and I think they see that more than anything.
Yeah, well, towards the end of the book, you have a line or a sentence that I highlighted that I thought encapsulated this really well and really resonated. And it's, because I reckoned with the worst of Black history, I could reckon with the worst of human history. And by bringing forth the best of Black history, I could bring forth the best of being human. And I mean, to me, that just sort of says it all, right? Like it's the complexity, the wonderfulness of somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. and the flaws of somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or Ronald Reagan, or go on down the list. Thomas Jefferson, you mentioned him earlier, and the ways in which we need we would benefit from really taking a more nuanced and critical thinking look at the complexity of individuals and groups and how they sort of fit together. So I don't know if there's anything you want to expound on there, but that to me just sort of really drove the point home.
Yeah, I think that's really where I wanted to leave everybody. Again, with the particulars of the Black experience, so we can explore all these stories of Black history and the complexity of the Black experience and Black humanity. But, the reason I named my platform the Humanity Archive and not the Black History Archive is because, I'm always trying to see what those universal threads are that hold us together. So that's what it all came back to, full circle for me. Starting in that library with the Black History section, but then expanding to, all of human history within the pluralism and diversity of the library, where everybody is represented, and you can bring it all together there. So that's it was a great place to end for me.
Yeah, and as I love the book. I can't recommend it enough to people as they think about not just history, but also a lot of our culture war things, because as somebody personally so frustrated and so sort of fed up with this sort of tribal polarization, the recognition and understanding, and I didn't do a great job of giving you opportunity to sort of pull out some of the actual stories of Black history that you talk about. That's why I say, so get the book. I mean, it's not, you do a really great job of that, but it's also, I was reading it, and not that I expected it to be sort of tribalistic or polarized, having met you before, but again, I was reading it and just sort of like, almost like clapping in my head, like, yes, like this is the kind of literature and writing and thinking that we need to have around these really thorny and wicked problems in ways that will help us move forward. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate the work. I appreciate the passion. I appreciate the way in which you're approaching it. And again, as I think about how do we help educators and non-educators sort of think and advocate for the sort of liberal science approach, this is a great example of it. And in the context of, as you said, sort of the sort of whitewashed versions of history and missing pieces and things that we don't have in our history curriculum. So I want to make sure that I know you've got book clubs and you've got the website, and where should people go and find you and find the book and anything else you want to talk about, that kind of thing?
The central hub is just going to be at www.thehumanityarchive.com. It's thehumanityarchive.com, and there you'll find links to my book club where we explore different literature and have dialogue and community, the podcast where I tell overlooked history stories, and then I have some history courses up there, and you can also find the link to my book. So, go there, follow me on Instagram is where I'm most active, at the Humanity Archive. So, thehumanityarchive.com is the hub for everything. So, I appreciate you having me here, and the kind words and the dialogue today.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can continue our conversation and think about collaborating. And certainly, again, educators, definitely get the book. Definitely check out the website. Jump into the book club and that kind of thing. So thanks so much, Jermaine.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you found this conversation to be useful, thought-provoking, or something that's worth commenting on and sharing, please do so with your friends, your social networks, and leave reviews where you listen to your podcasts. It's really helpful for our podcast and hopefully for anybody that you might share it with. And of course, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com if you have questions about our professional development, or email me at drew@teachthought.com.